You've got McAvaney, Cometti and Roberts. And then you've got these two, nuffies, living in denial. It's Croft and Horto. Welcome to the Fat Side Podcast.
Well, footy is almost back. It's getting very, very exciting indeed, but we're still doing our quarantine interviews. And today, I reckon this is the biggest guest we've had so far, Rob, because this man is an absolute icon of the game. He's commentated millions of VFL, AFL footy matches, and it's an absolute pleasure to have him on the Fat Side Podcast. Mr. Sandy Roberts, welcome.
Gentlemen, great to be with you on the Fat Side Podcast.
Well, it's great to have the identity at the start of the Fat Side Podcast, isn't it, Rob?
Yes, Sandy did our voiceover a couple of months back, and now he's actually on the show, so everyone gets to enjoy the dulcet tones even more.
No, it's very good. Now, Sandy, how has isolation been? I believe it's been pretty cushy. You've been down at your beautiful farm, so please tell the viewers and the listeners what you've been up to.
Actually, Rob and Adrian, I've found it not too upsetting, simply because there's plenty to do here. So I have no trouble at all in filling the days. I do feel very sorry for people who are perhaps living in apartments or something like that and are just so restricted and confined. If that was me, I'd go up the wall within a day or two. So I really feel for them. But no, I think we've been fairly fortunate. And the other thing, being somewhat isolated anyway, it's not really new to us. So we're getting through. I mean, there are obviously things with the restraints as far as people communicating and visiting and things like that, but we'll get back to that.
Yeah, lovely. I like that. Now, Sandy, we want to go back right to the start. Something that we're probably not aware of, or most footy fans aren't aware of, is where it all started for you. So where did you grow up? What was your childhood like, Sandy?
I grew up, Adrian, on a farm in the southeast of South Australia, outside a little town called Lucindale, and from there went to school in Adelaide. So I was at boarding school there. So missed a lot of home life in early teens, but really enjoyed boarding school. Then left there and got a job as a copy boy. I was always keen on journalism, and so I was fortunate enough to get a gig as a copy boy, which was basically a glorified tea maker, and you delivered the newspapers to the senior journalists. You only got the chance to, you were given the chance of actually writing an article for the news. That was the name of the paper in Adelaide. And you got a byline, and that's how you worked towards getting graded. However, Rupert decided after I'd been there, I think for 15 months, that he didn't want copy boys anymore. So we all got the sack. So I thought, well, what do we do here? And I decided to go to Perth to have a look over there, and I got off the train, walked down the main street of Perth, which was St George Street, I think, and I saw a sign with steps leading downstairs, and the sign was 6 p.m, the radio station. So I thought, I'll go in here and have a crack. So I met the news director. He sent me into a booth with some scripts, and I was fortunate enough to get the job as a D-grade journalist, and sort of it really all started from there. But there was, guys, another gentleman who was in the building, and I soon discovered he was an on-air talent, and a pretty good one as well. He was I think when I started, he was doing late afternoons, sort of 4 to 7 shift. His name was Dennis Cometti. So that was a long, long time ago, and it's just so strange how we met like that and how our lives have become somewhat intertwined.
So you've started there at that radio station in Perth. You said you're doing a bit of news stuff. When did it become more sports focused?
Rob, not for a while, because I left 6 p.m. after just over a year or year and a half, and decided to take a trip overseas. Was overseas for a similar time. Came back and I started working in radio at 3CS in Colac, which was interesting. And I went on holidays, I think, after a year at 3CS over to Adelaide, and I popped into the Channel 7 studios in Adelaide, and I knew the managing director there was a gentleman by the name of John Doherty. So I went and saw him and asked for a job. He said, "No, look, go away. You've got no experience. If you can get some television experience, come back in 12 months. So I then applied for a job at BCV8, which was a television station in Bendigo, and I got that job, was there for a year, and so then I went back to Adelaide and said, "I've had some experience, John. I have another crack."
Yeah.
And he said yes, and I got the job. So sport came, well, I suppose not initially, but because I was employed as a general announcer on a television station, and that's when you do voiceovers and news and things like that, a bit of everything, commercials and promotions. And then one day, the program manager just called me aside and he said, "Would you like to call football?" Seven over there had the rights. And I'd never called football in my life. And I hadn't given it a great deal of thought. I barracked for Norwood, who was a pretty strong club in those days in South Australia.
Yeah.
And started off by calling reserves footy, and that's how it started.
What year was that, Sandy?
Good question. That was 1973, I think.
Wow, because 1973, and then you jumped 7 years to 1980, and of course the Moscow Olympics was your first that you were involved in. How much of a watershed moment was that for you, being picked to be one of the commentators or the reporters at the Olympics in 1980? That must have been a huge thrill for you.
Yeah, it was just absolutely Adrian out of the blue, really. I was working away at Channel 7 in Adelaide, and in those days, it wasn't the 7 network as such. Yes, Channel 7 in Adelaide was like a cousin of Channel 7 in Melbourne, but it wasn't in the same unit as it is now. So it came out of the blue, and I was invited to join the team. Now, bear in mind at that time, because of the problems that Russia was encountering and the political unrest, and the then Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser had said to the Australian team and to the broadcasters, i.e. 7, "We won't hold anything against you if you don't want to go." And so what happened was, as you're probably aware, when you cover an Olympic Games,
we're not aware because we haven't done that yet, Rob.
One day.
The last 20 or 30 years, when a network covers the Olympic Games, they take a team of probably 350 people, roughly 350 people.
Wow.
So because of all the problems in 1980, I think our team was 49. So you can imagine the workload that we had. And the other interesting thing in those times, guys, is that unlike today, when you're told that, yes, you're going to an Olympics probably 18 months out from the said games, and you're also told what you're going to be doing, whether it be archery or diving or whatever. Back in those days, what happened was we'd have Ron Casey was the general manager of 7, and he was also hosting the broadcast as well. So he had a tremendous load, as well as looking after the rights and all that sort of thing. So what he would do, he would have a breakfast meeting every morning with the entire team, and he would stand up and he'd say, "Right, day 1, Bill Collins, you'll be doing athletics. Sandy Roberts, you'll be doing diving," and went through the team. So that's the first time you knew that that's what you were going to be doing. So then there'd be a mad scramble if I was doing diving, getting all the possible info you could. And anyway, look, it worked. And it was because it was my first games, I was flying on adrenaline. I just loved it. And I couldn't get enough of it. So, yeah, it was, and because I think when it's something that you really enjoy and it's the first time that you do it, it's probably the best because it's just so unique and so new. And the other thing was that halfway through that 2 weeks on air, Ron Casey, because of the pressure he was under at the halfway mark, got this terrible rash on his face and his neck, and it was because of the stress and the load that he was carrying. So he and Gary Fenton, who was the program director, called me in and asked me, could I take over the main hosting job, replacing Ron. So that was if I wasn't nervous when I did my first call of diving or whatever, I certainly was, when I started hosting. But again, it was just an amazing opportunity and an amazing experience.
Certainly thrown the deep end by the sounds of things, Sandy.
Oh, Rob, nice.
There we go. Nice little diving pun there. Thank you. How did you find Russia? Adrian and I were fortunate enough to go over there in 2018 for the World Cup. We were covering it over there. And
we were drunk half the time.
Yes, that was true. And we managed to get out there, enjoy the nightlife and meet some local people. Did you see a bit of action outside of the broadcast? Did you get out much?
Actually, I can assure you it was very different from when you went in 2018 because in 1980, the security was unbelievable and that was all controlled by the Russian army. So that if you wanted to walk from the main stadium, say to the IBC, which was the International Broadcast Centre, there were 2 rows of soldiers armed joining the 2 buildings or the arena and the building, and they were specifically for looking after the media to make sure that there was no problem. You were very, very restricted. You had a pass that would perhaps only get you, if you were doing diving or whatever, you could only go to the diving. If you were doing archery, you could only go to the archery. Unlike in today's games, you get a pass, and because you're the media, you can go to the pool or the main stadium or wherever. So they were making sure that they could control everyone so that they were safe, which is understandable. But again, look, it didn't really worry me in the least because it was so different. It was, it was just unbelievable. We did get the chance when we had a day off, which I think we only had about 1, each person had 1. And so you could have a look at the city. And well, see, in those days, Russia and Moscow was very different from what it is you guys would have found in 2018. I mean, there was no commercialism. I always remember their main store shop was a place called GUM, G-U-M, and it was huge. It was huge. It was like 2 Southlands and it was just unbelievable. So on our day off, we did spend some time there. But yeah, and a couple of things I remember that just blew me away is that they had, what do you call those things? If you have drinks in a thing and you put in a slot and out comes a Coke or whatever.
Vending machine, yeah.
These were in the street, but they weren't with Coke, or they were with vodka and ouzo, and there were young kids.
What a place.
Go there, put in the coins and out comes. And I think at that stage it was Russia had the worst alcoholism rate in the world and one of the highest divorce rates. So with those sort of things, when you've got one of the worst alcoholism rates in the world and one of the highest divorce rates, you're living in a very different city. But things certainly have changed since then. Commercialism and the Western world have had major influences. And as you would have seen, boys, when you went over in 2018, Moscow is a very different city than the one I experienced in 1980.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Rob, do you want to talk about how you fell in love in Russia at all? Do you want to let the listeners and viewers know about this?
No. That's a story for another day, I reckon.
Huh? Sandy wants to know.
Just met a Russian bride who wanted to move to Australia with me after knowing me for 24 hours. So that was fun.
She legitimately texted him, Sandy, the next day and said she was willing to move.
Yeah.
Although that's interesting because when we were over there, some of the boys had met some of the girls working with us. And because of the situation in Russia, a lot of them were very keen to get out.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
And she wanted to get out, didn't she, Rob?
Yeah, I think she did. Now, we should move on to football because this is a footy podcast after all. And if we're talking about ferals drinking lots of alcohol, Sandy, there's no better place to start than Moorabbin. Adrian and I, being our age, we didn't get to experience the suburban grounds properly. I went to Waverley like twice as a kid. You would have seen them all through your commentary days, but I know you are a St Kilda fan. What was Moorabbin like back in the day?
Oh, look, it was like most of the suburban grounds, the atmosphere was fantastic, but the Moorabbin ground was unique in that it had this one specific area called, and it was very aptly called too, the animal cage. This is where diehard St Kilda, and it was situated in front of the main stand. It was just a terrace with 44-gallon drums that were lit and used to keep the guys warm. And, well, the diehards would probably start having their first drinks because in those days you had the reserves that started at 11:45. They would start with the reserves and had their first drink at 11:45. So by the time the main game started, they had really warmed up and they were ready for a big afternoon. And the commentary position at Moorabbin in those days was at the back of the stand that was going down to the animal cage. So what we found happened was that whenever the St Kilda side would get a bum rap from the umpire or something like that, for some reason, these supporters would turn around and yell at the commentary box as if it was the commentator's fault. And it wasn't. And the same thing happened when you worked at, say, Windy Hill and on a scaffold, and the patrons are right underneath you. And they would do exactly the same thing. But St Kilda's was probably the worst. In some ways the worst, but in some ways the best. And I remember there was this one chap there who would be there every week. Every home game, he was standing next to the 44-gallon drum, keeping warm with a Bundy and Coke or something like that in his hand and enjoying the reserves. And his way of supporting was he would say, "Come on, Satyrs." And this caught on with all the people around him. So in the end, it was like a very poor, out of tune choir by 2 o'clock in the afternoon singing that. And he brought along the character and the personalities. And I mean, without being harsh, there are a lot of misfits down there. And but they enjoyed it, and we enjoyed it too. It helped make the day.
I like it. It sounds like St Kilda, not much to cheer about, so they would get sideways in no uncertain terms, Sandy. Just to put it lightly, and just enjoy the footy. So good on them. Yeah.
I think, excuse me, Adrian, I think speaking from someone who's barracks for the Melbourne Football Club, you've also undergone periods of pain.
Most certainly, Sandy. Thank you for putting me back in my box. I appreciate that. I want to talk about the 1990 grand final, Sandy, because that's one that you commentated, and it's a very famous grand final, particularly for two reasons. One reason being the quarter time brawl that we'll go into in just a moment, and then the other reason being the Collywobbles. Collingwood had lost 8 consecutive grand finals up until that point. There was so much pressure on them, and they finally broke that drought. Let's go to the brawl, because the brawl is quite fun, and Rob's an Essendon supporter. That brawl is vicious. I saw it on the telly again the other day, and I must say, Sandy, I've got the utmost respect for you, but I'm getting a little bit sick of these classic matches and having your voice in my living room every day. But that brawl is unbelievable. It's pretty vicious. Kickett's on the Essendon side is one that probably lost his head a little bit too much. And the Gavin Brown one, I actually rewound it a little bit to figure out what happened when he was on the deck. And it's still a bit of a mystery to me because it was such a big pack of players on top of him and underneath him, and I couldn't figure out what had happened. But that brawl and that electricity and that energy at quarter time was something to really behold. What was it like commentating that moment of the grand final?
Perhaps if you're unsure what happened to Gavin Brown, you could give Terry Danaher a call, and I'm sure he'll fill you in. Look, that was extraordinary, and it was extraordinary for me, Adrian, too, because I was calling my first grand final, and Essendon went into the game as favourites. And history tells us now that one of the trivia questions in football is who kicked 5 goals against Collingwood in the grand final of 1990. You used the word electric, and the atmosphere was very, very tense indeed. But what it did do, what Brown's actions, I believe, probably inspired Collingwood, was one of those who inspired Collingwood. I think Tony Shaw was inspirational as a leader that day. And he just had we all know what a player Tony Shaw was. He was just an annoying, aggravating, but very, very good club footballer. And of course, the other story that you haven't mentioned, and I think we should, was Darren Mullane, who played with a broken thumb. And as we all know, shortly afterwards, sadly, he lost his life. But I vividly remember, I'm pretty sure it was Mullane who had the ball when the siren sounded, and he just threw the ball up, caught it, and I think I said, and finally the drought is over. And whenever I see Eddie Maguire, still to this day, he tells me that his children have been watching the 1990 grand final. They know the broadcast just about off by heart. And he always finishes with, and the drought is over. So, yeah, it was a special game in many regards for me because, as I said, it was my first, but it was an extraordinary grand final. Wasn't one of the greatest games by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a grand final, so that still makes it a great game.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to ask you about commentators. Now, I follow a couple of other sports. I wouldn't say I follow basketball religiously. I certainly don't. I follow the playoffs, and I absolutely love it. And some of the commentary in that code is exceptional, in my opinion. One of my favourite commentators is Peter Drury. He's the English Premier League commentator. I'm a massive Liverpool fan. I love hearing his commentary. What about yourself, Sandy, being a former commentator? Who did you model yourself off? Any of the greats around the world? Did you have a chance to mingle with any of those particular people? Do you have a great respect for other commentators and other codes? What's the commentating fraternity like in that respect?
Yeah, I think it's probably changed, Adrian, over the years. Nowadays, if you're a broadcaster, it's pretty tough to survive, and you've got to have, you know, your wits about you if you are going to survive. But I was influenced by probably in the very early days, Ted Whitten, Lou Richards, and Lou in particular, because he was an entertainer. He wasn't just a caller of footy, but he loved the game, but he entertained and he had fun. And I think football is a game and it should be fun. I'm trying to think of other. In the very early days in Adelaide, I called with a former South Adelaide player by the name of Ian Day, who was a very competent broadcaster. I think you tend to, in my case, I think just do your own thing. You call it the way you think it should be called, and if that ends up putting some light and shade in it, or someone else might want to work solely or more heavily on statistics or things like that. But I think you tend to find your own individual style. And no, I don't think any two guys are really, you know, you couldn't say, oh, look, he's a dead ringer for him. I think everyone has their own different style.
996 prelim between Essendon and Sydney is a very famous call of yours. Seems like all your great calls are when Essendon loses. Any score will do. Tony Lockett. Yeah, can you talk to us a bit about that day?
Any score will do.
Well, it was, and it was unbelievable because Plugger, of course, had gone up to Sydney, not having had any luck down at St Kilda, and he settled in really well, and he was a very, very good player for Sydney, as we know. And I remember that game, Essendon led, and I think people generally felt Essendon, even though it was played up there, would be too good for them. Well, that wasn't the case. And Plugger got the ball just before the final siren. I think he was on a lead and he took a mark, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. No, I'm sure he was. He led out, took the mark, and was probably 45, 50 metres out, but almost directly in front. And, you know, the SCG is one of those grounds, because of the shape of the stands and everything, it holds the crowd noise really, really well. So the Sydney fans, particularly when Plugger's got the footy, go absolutely ballistic. And so the atmosphere was, you know, just unbelievable. And so a broadcaster tends to ride along with that atmosphere and get carried along. And so, yeah, and we knew the situation. Scores were level. He only had to kick a point. Any score will do. And that's what we said. And the point was enough for Plugger. And that saw them into the grand final. Only, I think, to get beaten the next week by North Melbourne.
Yes, they did. You've obviously commentated a few grand finals in your time, and also just watched plenty as a fan. What's your favourite grand final, whether it be as a commentator or just as a fan?
It's a good question, Rob, because I think, look, every grand final is important because it's a grand final. So you can have your low-scoring defensive battles between the West Coast Eagles and Sydney, but they were still really good games. I mean, they scored 6 or 7 goals each, but they were really exciting games. Then again, you can have high-scoring grand finals. I mean, Essendon and Collingwood in 1990 is, because it was my first, is one of my favourites. So, you know, I loved Brisbane Lions, particularly in 2001. when they started their three-peat. They were just a phenomenal side. There was absolute stars on every line and 3 stars on every line. So if you're talking generally, I'd say those 3 grand finals of the Brisbane Lions, but specifically that first one.
Beautiful. I love how you keep choosing finals that Essendon lost in. This is beautiful, Sandy. Keep it up. I'm sure. Come on. We love to rub a bit of salt into Essendon wounds, let's be honest. I want to just pick you up on a point. I actually texted you, so cat's out of the bag on this one, because I wanted to give you some time, Sandy, to have a think about this, because it's not a question that you want to pose to someone on the spot. And you've commentated a lot of VFL, AFL matches, as we've spoken about in this interview. One of the things that I love talking to my old man about over a beer is who are some of the great players that we've seen in the flesh. And one of our two of our favourite players that we've seen live, one is Brendan Favola. We love watching Brendan Favola live. It helped that he played for Yarrawonga, where my dad lives, and he got to go and watch him when he was playing for the Pigeons. But he was one that we just marvelled at and loved watching. Just a mercurial talent. The other one's Adam Goodes. He just glided across the field. What about yourself? Who's your top 5 most enjoyable players to ever watch during your time in the AFL system or circles?
I think it's a really unfair question, because you could have a top 20. And now, as you said, you did give me a bit of notice. So I'm going to give you some names and we'll see if we can get 5 out of them. Okay. Gary Ablett Sr., Michael Long, Peter Matera, Michael Voss, Simon Black, Robbie Flower, Simon Madden, Tony Modra. Now, then I go off at a tangent. They're not necessarily my favourites, but they're great to watch. Mark Jacko Jackson, Rotten Ronnie Andrews, Robert Mad Dog Muir. Then I come back to the Indigenous players. Andrew McLeod, Morris Rioli, Cyril Rioli, Matera again, Jimmy and Phil Cracker. So that's probably 20 players. To pick 5 out of those, I mean, Gary Ablett would be my number 1. Gary Ablett Sr. Is my number 1, because he was so strong. He was a brute of a man, that he was hugely talented and he could win you a game. And I think that's... And the other thing is there with Gary, a lot of people didn't go down to Cardinia Park to see Geelong play. They went to Cardinia Park to see Gary Ablett and what he was going to do on that particular day. So he's my number 1, ahead of Long and Voss and Black and Flower and guys like that.
No, it's a good list. It's a collective list, isn't it? It's a little bit different, Rob. I like that.
Yeah, I do. I like it a lot.
That's very good. Now, Sandy, I'm going to do some rapid fire questions, right? They're very, very simple. I think I've got 5. I had to scrub one out because I did Gary Ablett Sr. or Gary Ablett Jr. You've just summed it up there. It was clearly senior for you. So,
I think that's unfair, because you've perhaps taken away any advantage I might have had. What I was guaranteed at least 1 point, was I?
No. These are just rapid fire questions where I need quick answers.
These are opinion questions. Yeah.
These are just opinion questions. Rob will take you through the quiz soon. I know you're very pumped up to try and beat Glenn Manton, who's on 6. So we'll get there. Yeah, you'll get him. So the first question is, what is the first word that comes to mind when you think of Lance Whitnell?
Lance Whitnell. The first word I think of is problems.
Oh, poor Lance.
Problems. Gee, poor Lance. Okay, the next one. If you could live on a deserted island, but you could only choose one of these 2 people, who would it be? Ross Lyon or Mick Malthouse?
Mick Malthouse.
Ooh, he's gone the older vintage. The next one. Darren Goldspink or Razor Ray?
Razor Ray.
Oh, loves a bit of Razor Ray. If you were a player, Sandy, would you rather kick 10 goals or kick the winning goal after the siren?
The winning goal after the siren, if it was a grand final.
Well, I didn't stipulate that. So anyway, next one: Bruce McAvaney or Anthony Hudson?
Bruce.
I reckon that was close. You like Hutto, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very tough one.
Yep.
They're both very good.
And the final rapid fire: Carlton Draft or Victoria Bitter?
Carlton Draft.
Oh. That's a sponsorship. That's a cash for comment there.
There we go. All right, we'll wrap up with the quarantine quiz, Sandy. Now, you've been pre-warned about this. So 10 questions. Some of them are about AFL. Some of them are just general knowledge questions about who knows what. Trying to beat Glenn Manton on 6, trying not to go lower than Alex Johnson, who got 2. So
Rob, I'll try my best.
Question 1, we'll start with a football question. Who has kicked more AFL goals? Is it A, Jack Riewoldt, B, Josh Kennedy, C, Eddie Betts?
Good question. Jack Riewoldt.
That is correct.
You got
Jack
it.
Riewoldt. For those at home, Riewoldt 634, Kennedy 611, Eddie 600. Question 2. The Sapphire Coast is located in which Australian state or territory?
Good question. Sapphire Coast. New South Wales?
That is correct.
Oh, 2 from 2. Glenn
He's
Manton,
he's off to a flyer. Question 3.
Don't get carried away.
Here you go. Question 3. In 2001, Michael Jordan came out of retirement again to play for which NBA team? 2001.
Bulls?
No, in 2001 he came back and played for the Washington Wizards, which was when he was pretty much past it, but he came back for a bit of fun.
Not a basketball fan, Sandy.
No, I've been watching I have been watching The Last Dance. Enjoyed
Very
that.
good. It's very good. Question 4. Who is older, Paul McCartney or Mick Jagger?
Mick.
Incorrect. Mick's 76, Paul's 77.
Ah.
Question 5. In which famous battle was Napoleon defeated by the Duke of Wellington?
I should know this, but I'll pass.
Oh, there's a song about it.
Bonaparte's retreat.
No, it's Waterloo.
Oh, of course.
Okay.
Battle of Waterloo.
Question 6. A squared plus B squared equals C squared is also known as which mathematical theorem?
Pythagoras.
Pythagoras is correct. Well done. That's another one.
He's above Alex Johnson now.
There we go. Question 7. In 2015, the AFL Grand Final was played between Hawthorn and West Coast. Which other 2 teams made the prelims that year?
Hawthorn West Coast 2015. Hawthorn West Coast 2015. Geelong?
Incorrect. It was Fremantle and North Melbourne.
How weird is that?
Yeah.
Fremantle North.
Yeah, because Freo and West Coast were 1 and 2 that year going into the finals.
Wow. Weird.
And then obviously Hawthorn beat Fremantle. Question 8.
Mm-hmm.
How many gold medals did Australia win at the 2000 Sydney Olympics?
Gee. Can you give me a clue?
Okay, it's between 10 and 20.
17?
Oh.
Ooh, 16. Close. Question
I love
9.
how much it hurts when you don't get a question right.
Yeah. Question
Does.
9.
I'm in pain.
Question 9. This is a cricket question. Who scored the highest ever Test cricket innings by a number 11 batsman?
Dizzy Gillespie.
No, Dizzy wasn't at number 11. It was Ashton Agar who scored
Oh,
98
he scored
on
100,
debut.
didn't he?
98.
99.
98.
There we go. Yeah. Close. I think Dizzy was 10 or 9 he batted. But final question. Scott Cummings played for 4 AFL clubs. Can you please name the 4 clubs that Scott Cummings played for?
Essendon.
Yep.
West Coast.
Yep.
Essendon, West Coast.
Come on, Sandy.
Yeah, I know. The old brain. Essendon, West Coast. Did he play for Collingwood?
Yes.
And there's one more.
One more.
And did he have a stint? He didn't go to St Kilda, did he?
No.
No. Listen, I'll give you a clue. So, in order of the clubs that he went, it was Essendon first, then it was this club, then West Coast, then Collingwood. So, this was his second team.
Ooh.
Was it a club that was not in Victoria?
Yes,
Port Adelaide.
that is correct. Yay. Well done, Sandy. So, wrap it up there, Sandy. You finished on 4. So, you're sandwiched in between Brad Sewell and Russell Robertson there. So, you're in good company.
So a pretty poor effort, really.
Yeah,
But you
nice.
did ask questions that were very, very close,
Yeah.
like Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney, like 76, 77. That's a toss
does
of a
look
coin,
good.
but a good quiz.
Yeah. I thought you would have got Waterloo, but apparently not.
Yeah, I should have.
You really could have been above Glen Manton.
Yeah, you were very close on a couple.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, Glenn's still sitting at the
Like
top.
saying
Yeah.
if.
Yeah, well, that's Melbourne's mantra, isn't it? If
It's all- yes.
if
Yeah.
if Gary Lyon and David Schwartz didn't do his knee, and if this happened and Tingay was fit, we would have won in '94.
Four.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Do you know how many old cronies tell me that? God.
Well, what's the other one? If Jim Steins hadn't run over the mark,
Oh, don't.
Yeah.
That hurts.
Yeah, against
That
Gary.
hurts. Actually, here is the great man, Sandy. There he is.
oh, golly.
G-
A little Jim Steins card.
There he is. Oh, Jim. There had to be a little bit more Melbourne in this because you were criticising me earlier about there being too many Melbourne people on.
We've had enough Melbourne, actually.
That's okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Just a quick one before we do let you go. When footy comes back in the next month or so, are you excited about it? Rob and I have spoken about this at length, and my personal opinion is I think I'll be very excited for the first few weeks, but unfortunately, and you spoke about the 96 prelim and the energy and the crowd and the atmosphere. It's one of the biggest reasons we go to the footy. So I love the ambition to bring it back. I think it'll be a great release. I'll watch a hell of a lot of footy. Will I enjoy it as much as I normally do? I just don't think so, Sandy, because there just won't be that atmosphere. What do you think?
I echo your thoughts exactly. I think we saw in round 1, I mean, it's you take the crowd out of the game, which is the people's game, and you're not left with too much at all. And I mean, I think it's terrible. This is a long bow, but I would have, if they're not going to have the crowds at all, I would have almost said, well, let's not have a season. Because, it's going to be very hard, very, very hard now for people. Not everyone's got Foxtel. That's the only place I think you can see every game.
Yeah.
So those sides that are lower down on the ladder and those people who support those sides, one, the side is not going to get the airtime on free to air, so that their supporters are missing out altogether. They can't go to the game and they can't watch them. So, yeah, I think it's sad. But look, it's what it is, and we've got to accept it. And the footy diehard lovers will say, at least we've got a game of football, and you can't argue with that.
Yeah, and
Agree.
they need to play on. I think one of the big things for just the average punter is people have realised how important the TV deal is and the broadcast rights and how much money that injects into the game. So I think it's great that they're going to push on. They're going to get games. Yes, it'll be crowdless. It'll be weird. It won't be as great as it normally is. But the reality is they've got to do what's right. And what's right, in my opinion, is if it's in a safe environment and it means that the clubs will get more money as a result and it can help them gradually build again towards the next season, then I guess that's the biggest positive to come out of it. But yeah, it is a very sad and sorry situation because it just doesn't feel like Melbourne at the moment.
I think the other thing to come out of it is just bear in mind when the next broadcast rights come around, the numbers and the figures being bandied around, I'm sure, are going to be very, very different than the last contract that was signed by the AFL and the media parties in Seven and Fox.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But, mate, it's been wonderful to have a chat to you, and it's good to see that you're safe and well. And it's been great to take a trip down memory lane and learn about some of your famous calls, and really enjoyed learning about the 1980 Olympics as well. And look, I'm a little bit disappointed that you only got 4 in the quiz and you had a big opportunity to take over Glenn, but maybe we'll get you on another time and you can have another tilt at it.
I'm going to say thank you, and I'm now going onto the internet to read all I can about the Battle of Waterloo.
Beautiful.
Perfect. That's what we want from anyone we interview. To go back to the drawing board and then reset and come back next time. It's good. That's very Michael Jordan-esque,
Yeah.
Sandy. It's very good. All right, take care, mate. Thanks for jumping on.
Thank you.